Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we look at the issue of stress in our lives and how we can understand the stress that we're all experiencing and how we can develop our resilience. The issue of stress has been a major theme on Humanity Rising since we first started in May of 2020. Because one of the immediate effects of the pandemic, in which we all found ourselves in lockdown and isolation and wearing masks and keeping social distancing, was that virtually every stress indicator everywhere around the world went up. People were experiencing more anxiety, depression. There was domestic violence, there was alcoholism increases, drug abuse, road rage. Everyone was in a state of fear, and everyone experienced more stress. And just last week, when we did a 5-day program on the American Black male experience, one of the themes during that week is that the combination of racism, poverty, and gender, in and of themselves, independent of the pandemic, create stress. And this is one reason why from the very first program back in 2020, at the beginning of every session, we started with just centering ourselves in our hearts. And then when I read James Nestor's book on breath and realized that they had a technique of what they call the 5.5 breathing, that's what we've been doing every day on Humanity Rising. And as I've said many, many times, this is just a simple practice whereby we can ameliorate our stress by bringing coherence to the body, optimizing our body systems, smoothing our emotional reflexes, and bringing acuity to our minds. Our world is so stressed out right now that the challenge of developing one's inner equilibrium may be the most important thing any of us do to ensure that we can navigate an increasingly hyper-complex world with a modicum of elegance and in a way that not only empowers us, but inspires others to be more emotionally resilient. So that's our program today. We're going to focus right on one specific little point, and that's the telomeres, which we've talked about before. But we have probably the world's leading expert on this matter, Elissa Epel, who I'll introduce in a moment. But first, let us just simply breathe together in this stressed out world. Just consciously breathing. You're going to hear the sound of a bell. Those of you who are new to Humanity Rising, breathe in slowly for about 5.5 seconds. You'll hear another bell. Breathe out for about 5.5 seconds. That gives you 5.5 breaths a minute, and you bring in 5.5 liters of air. According to the ancient mystics and modern science, it's perhaps the most effective breathing technique known that can bring the coherence and the resilience that we need to deal with a world of overwhelming stress. So welcome everyone to our program today. Let us just take a moment to breathe together as one. Thank you, everyone. It's always so good to breathe as one in the spirit of the observation of Plotinus several thousand years ago, that the whole universe breathes as one. As we breathe, the universe breathes. And as we breathe, we bring coherence to every aspect of our being, particularly if it's conscious breathing. And it's in that spirit that I am delighted today to introduce Dr. Elissa Epel, who, with Elizabeth Blackburn, the Nobel laureate, wrote the Telomere Effect, which I read and millions of people around the world read. She's a professor and vice chair of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California at San Francisco. And her specialty, as she'll lay out today, is the effect of stress on our biological systems and our biological aging, and how contemplative practices and various interventions can enable us to lead lives of more psycho-emotional resilience. And her new book is called The Stress Prescription, which in some ways we consider Humanity Rising, is a stress prescription, gathering every day, breathing together, feeling love in our hearts for the world, and talking about issues that matter in a way that looks for solutions and seeks to inspire all of us to just simply be better human beings at this time of extraordinary global fragility. So, Elissa, I want to thank you for joining us today and welcome you. Elissa's going to take some time to tell us more about herself and her work and her books, and then I'll circle back and we'll have a conversation. So if any of you have issues you want to raise or comments or questions, just put them in the chat and we'll get to them as best that we can in the time that we have today. Elissa, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jim. I can't tell you how much it means to me to speak to this amazing audience on Humanity Rising. I am part of this audience, so I really had tremendous feelings of global connectivity and comfort and awe from what you launched early in the pandemic. I was a real regular, and it's just amazing. So I'm honored to be with you all today.
Thank you.
So I thought that I would start by, the nice thing is we do have more time than usual. And so I'm going to leisurely, not in my usual high-speed pace, tell you how, I guess, highlights of what I have found over my 30-year research career, studying the mind-body connection and focusing on the understanding how stress is related to aging in these complex ways, how it affects us down to our cells. Jim already mentioned the telomeres, which are one of the fascinating mechanisms of how we age. And so I'll tell you about that book. I summarized with my colleague, Elizabeth Blackburn, a Nobel laureate, how all the different lifestyle and mental and social factors that shape our cell aging. So I'll first tell you about that. That is a book called The Telomere Effect. And this is in 30 languages. And it really helped people understand we all have telomeres, even if we don't know it, every single cell in our body. And they're sensitive and they care about our well-being and our daily, I'll say our daily lifestyle, which is kind of translated into the chemical environment of our cells and how stressful versus restorative and reparative that is. And then in the second half, I'll talk more about some practical strategies for managing stress that are in a book I just wrote that was released in the last month called The Stress Prescription. And I really welcome input along the way. I know some of you are listening on platforms where you can't type in, but for those of you on Zoom, et cetera, I will be asking you questions as well. So I would like to start, well, I've already told you that we're going to talk about telomeres, but I'll just start like kind of stepping back and explaining this line of work, which really started, probably 65 years ago, researchers started studying stress in a mechanistic way to understand how stress gets under the skin. And that has been very illuminating at every level. And a few things that we know from that work is the importance of control. And I'll add, especially for us as people living in this day and age with a very volatile environment and volatile future, the stress of uncertainty and how our mind works, our brain as well as our mind, to really grapple and feel a lot of struggle and strain with having a lack of predictability in our future or even in our day. So our understanding our mind is a phenomenal life life practice, really, just getting to know our own mind and managing it so that we're not giving into this overreactive stress response that we are really built to have for our survival, some of us more than others. So so way back, I have been very interested in understanding how stress gets under the skin to affect biological aging way before disease starts, starting on really day one of birth. What are the factors that shape our biological aging? And I really come to this with a lens of focusing on stress and thoughts and health behaviors, things that really matter because they add up every day and they create the chronic state that we live in. I sometimes think of it as stress soup. What's the level of kind of stress versus restoration in your cells? What are you creating each day? And another way I like to think about this is, how much stress are you holding in your body when nothing is happening, just at baseline? What is baseline for you? You can just check in right now and ask yourself that question. You can start with the body. The body is the holder of stress, the embedded stress that we carry from past experiences, trauma, lived experiences, recent experiences, the sleep we got last night. So all sorts of experiences are embedded in our nervous system in both short and long-term ways. So right now, you might just close your eyes and check in. It was lovely breathing that we did together. And I agree with Jim, it's one of the most direct ways to get at this unconscious stress that we hold. So you might just close your eyes and do a check-in from the top of your head down to your face, your eyebrows, your jaw. Are you holding tension? Your shoulders, your hands, are they clenched? Can you relax them? All the way down to your feet. That check-in is precious. That's one of our few tools, using our mind to notice our stress state. And I call that catch and release. And when we practice these mindful check-ins throughout the day, we can actually potentially change our baseline level of stress so that when nothing stressful is happening in the moment, we can let our bodies relax and restore. And that turns out to be really important because it's an antidote to carrying around chronic stress with us. There are very few situations where stress is constantly happening, but because we carry it in our mind with our thoughts, anticipating the future, worrying about the past, reliving things, or just negative mind wandering, these are the process of chronic stress. This is how we carry it with us. So that kind of turning on the light of awareness is step one, necessary but not sufficient. So I will go through many other strategies for releasing the unconscious stress that we carry. So about 24 years ago, I started looking for how we might measure the cost of chronic stress in our cells. We knew that, for example, chronic work stress can not just elevate blood pressure that day, keep it high at night, that non-dipping profile, but also create long-term states like hypertension. But we didn't know much at the cellular level about what was happening. Now we know that stress and trauma. So I'm going to say toxic stress, not all forms of stress, chronic unrelenting stress without enough resources or respite, and trauma, particularly at an early age. These are associated with accelerated indices of biological aging in our cells. And I'm going to just mention 4 ways that this has been measured and this stress relationship has been shown, and then I'll focus more on telomeres. The cells have many different ways that aging is measured. There are many aging mechanisms in our cells. So one is inflammation, and we think of that as like the royal highway to aging. We can get a creep up of inflammation in our blood, systemic inflammation as we age. And that is associated with, for example, long-term caregiving when you develop depression with that, with chronic diseases, and with some biological aging, but not all. So there's a lot of variability in who develops inflammatory states with aging. We call that inflammation. Now, everything about our lifestyle can either create a healthy restorative state or a catabolic state where we're creating a stress response, inflammation, oxidative stress. And so I'm going to talk a lot about chronic stress in our mind, since that is so common and we know a lot about how to manage that now. But everything about our lifestyle is also important. And we can think about the question of, is this creating an inflammatory state, an excess of free radicals, or is this calming those chemical processes? So, for example, a Mediterranean diet is associated with anti-inflammatory and antioxidative states in the blood and in the cells, and it's associated with longer telomeres. So of the 4 aging mechanisms, we have inflammation, epigenetic aging, telomere length, and mitochondria. And we've studied all 4 of those and have shown this kind of toxic stress relationship with indices of accelerated biological aging. And other people have studied these. And for most of these, except for mitochondria, which are new, there are many reviews. So these are established relationships, at least cross-sectionally, in population-based studies. The epigenetics are patterns of methylation on the genes that turn genes on and off. And there's a pattern that's been identified by Steve Horvath and other colleagues that is associated with chronological age, and another pattern that's associated with early death. And those patterns have been associated with early trauma and chronic stress. And we don't know much about the biological mechanisms, what creates that epigenetic profile, how quickly can we reverse it? Those are all new questions. The mitochondria in our cells are the batteries. They give us energy. We really want to take care of our mitochondria. We now realize those are just at the core of health and aging and mental health. And so with my colleague, Martin Picard, we have been examining the level of energy in the cells, or potential to create energy, by looking at the mitochondria, how many there are, how strong the enzymes are that they're cranking out to create energy, ATP. And what we have found is that chronic stress in the form of being a caregiver, unpaid family caregiver for years and years, is associated with dampened levels of mitochondria. And that is really amazing. But what's even more amazing is not just that our mitochondria are sensitive to our thoughts and feelings and our level of stress, but that they're also sensitive to our positive mood. So in this same study of caregivers, we found that it's not about being a caregiver. It's about, how is your mood when you wake up, and at the end of the day, can you carry some positive affect with you through your day, especially on a hard day? Can you still feel some content, some life satisfaction, some joy of living? And even though you might feel a lot of negative emotions, we think that the presence of some of those positive emotions are very protective and important. So let me get to the telomeres. They're at the tips of the chromosomes in every cell in our body. We have these protective caps called telomeres, and they are sensitive to the biochemical environment. They protect the genome. We want to protect the genome as much as possible because our genes get damaged with aging and things go awry. Cells die, they become cancerous. So the telomeres have a very important function throughout our long life. And if we want to be living to 80 and 90 and above, we need to have sturdy telomeres. Every time our cells replicate, they can shorten, but there's an enzyme telomerase, which is actually, it's an amazing intracellular enzyme that can rebuild the telomeres. It can add back base pairs and make them longer and thus more protective. So we've been very interested in what increases telomerase in a healthy way, not chronically. Too much telomerase can actually cause bad cells to keep replicating and create tumors. So we want a healthy balance like everything else in life. We want to boost our telomerase naturally with exercise, healthy diet, and I'll say tending to our mental health. We have, and others have found that chronic depression and really most different psychological disorders are associated with shorter telomeres. And we don't know what's the chicken or the egg there, but we think that there's probably a bidirectional relationship, but we do know that chronic stress can accelerate telomere shortening, and chronic stress also creates, or let's say triggers, depression in vulnerable people. So we do think that managing stress again and the hyperreactive stress response is critical there. It's key there. So in terms of, so after we discovered this relationship about 19 years ago, that stress was dampening down telomerase, increasing oxidative stress, and shortening telomeres, we then wanted to reverse engineer that and ask, well, what if we examine meditation retreats or people who meditate regularly? Do they have longer telomeres? Can they boost their telomerase? And so there's been a series of studies, not enough and not let's say gold standard large randomized clinical trials that were planned a priori, but there is some consistent evidence that people who practice loving kindness meditation do tend to have longer telomere length. My colleague Barbara Fredrickson, who studies positive emotion, did a workplace trial of meditation, loving kindness meditation, and found that telomeres stayed sturdy, maybe even lengthened, in those who had loving kindness versus mindful attention versus control. We've done several meditation retreat studies. It looks like telomerase can be boosted with a week or more of a meditation retreat. That's very exciting to us. We don't know how long that lasts. These are mostly small samples, but presumably if you continue as a lifestyle habit, you would continue to benefit. And in one study, we were examining transcendental meditation. And this was a retreat of Deepak Chopra's. And we went in and we got blood at the beginning of the week, at the end of the week. And we found that those who went in with a trained mind, who have already practiced meditation, had a boost in telomerase during that week. And everyone else we recruited, they were novices. Half of them learned how to meditate, the other half relaxed at the pool. We found that those groups didn't show a change in telomerase that week, but they did show dramatic changes in the output of their genes. The genes create proteins. They create every protein in our body, right? And they're creating proteins every day. And they're often creating proteins for stress and for fighting bacteria and antigens. They're creating immune responsive proteins. And what we found was that all of the activity in the stress related genes and the immune related genes were damped down. Like the body gets the message, you don't have to fight so hard. You can turn off, we're safe. And so we had a machine learning algorithm that was able to predict whether people were on their first day of their retreat or their last day of the retreat with over 90% accuracy, because the body is so responsive, really immediately within a day, to creating a safe environment. So it's not just that we remove stress cues, but there's all these safety cues. We respond to nature and to other people who are smiling and supportive. All of these safety cues help our body bring it down to more of a homeostatic level. So I know people may be wondering, how do you measure telomeres? I will self-disclose that I've never measured mine. I don't really want to know. We know that telomeres can be influenced by both, of course, genetically, but also indirectly transmitted. If a parent has very short telomeres, the offspring may. If there's a lot of prenatal stress, telomeres are shorter in the offspring. We just published a paper on that, and others have as well. So it's transmitted across generations. We know early trauma is associated with shorter telomeres even as an adult. And so it can be threatening, it can be alarming, it can be disappointing to know that your average length is short. But what's more important is that our health behaviors can boost telomerase, can maintain sturdy telomeres, and excuse me, as well as I mentioned, having daily states of restoration. We know that from our retreat studies. And so we are, because we're kind of biologically iterative, we are creating different states in every minute, really. There are many things we can do to protect our telomeres. And so I focus on those, knowing what to do, instead of kind of measuring and monitoring them, which some people do. And I have a whole page on my website written by Elizabeth Blackburn and I about just some pitfalls or some things to know if you're going to measure your telomeres. It's on the Telomere Effect page. And there are accuracy issues. If you're really long, you're going to shorten faster. That's just a law of initial values. It's part of homeostasis. If you're really short, your cells are going to be protecting those telomeres like crazy, probably have higher telomerase. So you could measure them repeatedly. I know people who really are into the quantified self, and they do like to measure change related to different changes in lifestyle. And if you're going to, do it repeatedly, it makes more sense than a one-time measure. Okay, so I'm going to ask if there are any questions about telomeres before I move on to talking more about stress in the mind. You measure them with blood. You just telomeres are in every tissue, and they're at different lengths in different tissues, although it's correlated across our body. They all come from one gamete. So we mostly study these in blood, and we're lucky that the age of the immune system, our white blood cells, are so predictive of longevity and early disease. Antidepressants are probably, I'm just reading questions in the chat. They are probably protective. And my colleague Owen Wolkowitz did a study where we followed people with depression. We measured how many years of their life they've suffered with depression. And what we found was that telomere length was associated with non-medicated depression, but not medicated depression. So it did look protective. Jim, did you have any questions about telomeres before I move on?
Well, one question that just occurs to me is the difference between the different aspects of like inflammation and telomeres and the other indicators that you mentioned. Do each of them carry distinctive stress responses, or are they basically pretty much the same?
Very good question. They are each such different mechanisms, and they really respond in the short run differently, but they're all interconnected, not surprisingly. And so when the mitochondria gets really old and worn out, it releases dramatically high levels of reactive oxygen species or free radicals. And that just starts taking chunks out of the telomeres. So telomeres are damaged by oxidative stress. So there's a pathway there. When the telomeres damage and it sends out these cries, these cell cycle arrest signals, it's basically saying, don't go on, this cell is, maybe going bad. And so some signals go directly to the mitochondria and clamp that down and damage the activity of the mitochondrial enzymes. So they're like best friends. They're like this. They're right near each other. Mitochondria are surrounding. And, in terms of inflammation, again, it's a bidirectional. So when we develop a lot of inflammation, it could be from a, poor quality lifestyle, could be from chronic stress and depression. This accelerates the telomere shortening. So there's that direction. And then when the telomeres get old and the cell basically registers, whoops, our telomeres are really short, we might have a catastrophic cellular event. We might turn into a cancer cell. This is not good. That cell becomes senescent, which means it says, we're no longer dividing. We don't want to create bad cells, but instead we're going to become pro-inflammatory. And that old cell starts cranking out pro-inflammatory cytokines. So all of these different aging mechanisms are they stay well together, and they also degrade together.
Yeah. And another question that just was coming up when you were talking about Deepak Chopra, you said that some people just sort of stayed by the pool. Yeah. And I was wondering what the difference would in your research between the people who went through a Deepak, meditative retreat, as opposed to people who just relaxed by the pool.
Yeah. I mean, this was a really surprising study to us, although, of course, in retrospect, we should never be surprised by relaxation. So we randomized a sample of women. We advertised, come spend a week at this resort. And I got phone calls of, are you kidding? Is this a scam? I was like, it's real. We have funding to really study meditation in a controlled way. And you will be randomized to either a group where you listen to a health lecture, you can leisurely take a walk, you can hang out by the pool all day, or you're randomized to at least 8 hours a day of practices, yoga, transcendental meditation, reflection, a really intense experience. And, we see the novices. We were, of course, there the whole week watching, and you see a lot of tears in the meditation retreat group. People are for the first time looking at their mind content, and things come up, and it's not always a beautiful, relaxing experience, but it is part of the amazing process of seeing what's there and getting to know your mind. And it's the later, more experienced meditators who benefit more immediately biologically from retreats. So the difference between the randomized novice meditators who got the retreat versus the randomized control group was, in terms of self-report, indistinguishable. Everyone felt fantastic at the end of the week. I've never seen scores move so, in such a dramatic way, like 60 or 70% vitality, lower depression and stress, increases in mindfulness. Now, there were some subtle differences, but I'll just say everyone felt rebooted and recharged. And then when we looked at the gene expression, both groups had increases in mitochondrial activity, telomerase activity, lower inflammatory activity in their gene expression. And it was what we'll call the vacation effect. The cells didn't know who was meditating and who wasn't. They knew that there wasn't work, there weren't computers, there weren't iPhones if they were following our rules. Now, here's what's interesting. We followed these women over the next year, and we went back and asked them about their levels of depression, stress, mindfulness. And that's when we saw the difference. Those who had learned TM meditation maintained lower levels of depression 10 months later. That blew our mind. And it particularly benefited those with early life trauma. And that, again, is something that's starting to show up in the meditation literature. We know that early life trauma creates a propensity, a readiness to see the world in a threatening way. And when we measure daily stress responses, people they experience more threat. And that is something that is hard to change. But of course, the meditation teaches them, well, what next? You don't have to you can recognize those thoughts and you can choose not to pursue and ruminate on those. So meditation was particularly helpful for those with early trauma.
Well, that's extraordinary. So that in the moment, whether you're by the pool or you're doing transcendental meditation, the effect is essentially the same, but over time, the people who meditated and presumably continue to meditate have a dramatically more positive long-term experience.
Yes, exactly. And some of them were still meditating and some weren't. So there are probably different changes in schemas, or let's say metacognition, the ability to just see thoughts as just thoughts. That kind of shift once you learn more about your mind and how it works. You don't take it as seriously.
Right. So these little meditations we're doing every morning on Humanity Rising actually have a cumulative effect.
I strongly believe that. And I think the idea of short 5 to 15 minute practice is, particularly in the morning, is like medicine. I just think it's one of the smartest things we can do. And we've had a lot of studies looking at, well, how do people wake up? And what if you wake up feeling really stressed versus feeling joyous? Is that related to your telomerase or your cortisol? The answer is yes, at least cross-sectionally. And then the question is, can you change those by waking up and nudging yourself in this restorative way of telling your body, I'm safe. My day is not going to overwhelm me and, threaten my survival. It's so easy to wake up with that, right? With a to-do list and the bad news on media. So we've been studying morning practices, and we've been comparing the different low arousal, slow breathing, meditation, and high arousal exercise, HIIT, high intensity interval training, and Wim Hof breathing. And the beauty here, I've been particularly interested in this high hormetic stress or high intensity ways of burning up and metabolizing stress in our body, because that is a different way to maybe reach the same outcome, where we're changing our mind state through our body, but because we're creating a stressful state, it then gets countered by the anti-stress response by bringing down the let's say increasing the parasympathetic activity, so the vagal tone, or the counter-regulatory response to the stress response. So it's a different way. We can directly try to relax. Breathing is fantastic because it's a direct route. You could do it with mindfulness if you're persistent. And then there's also creating stress and then letting the body do the work of recovery and relaxation. The bottom line is that we found really pretty significant improvements in depression and stress in all 4 conditions equally. So as a researcher, I was like, damn, what happened to the horse race? I want to see which is best. But as a person, I'm like, this is fabulous news for everyone. You got to do what you're going to do, what you're going to like, right? And what you're going to like is what you're going to build in every day. And having these habits is really the infrastructure of relaxation. If your body knows what's next, it can relax. Predictability, conditioning.
Well, that's a very important point. I know you want to move on with other parts of your presentation, but that's a very important point that you're making, that it's the finger pointing to the moon, right? Of the Buddha, that whatever the finger is, whatever the mechanism for, whether it's Wim Hof or TM, or someone said in the chat, singing, whatever it is that gets you to that relaxed state has essentially the same effect. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. The body is not so specific. I mean, it's very hard to find someone who says this mind-body practice is superior to this one. They are all working on slowing breathing, making it more rhythmic, slowing the heart rate, or, if they're a low arousal one, or the kind of stress relaxation, like certain yoga breathing. And they are increasing vagal tone, at least during the practice. And so there is a common state that we induce with any type of mind-body practice. And for some, going into nature can be also like a meditation, even though you're kind of letting the environment do the work. You're not effortlessly trying to change your body state. It's happening. And there's so many beautiful studies. Writing about nature science was my absolute favorite part of this new book, because I had no idea there was so much good research on put a human in nature, have them open up their sensory gates. You know, it can reduce blood pressure, cortisol, heart rate, if it's repeated. So it's got to be, as you said, kind of the building on what the body experiences in little blips, building on that, repeating that.
And each person finding whatever the pathway is that works for them, because the results are essentially the same. That's very profound insight, Elissa, because there's always the discussions in these circles of which has more effect on whom and why. And it's very comforting to know that you can pick your own plan, and it's going to work, whether it's tree breathing or Wim Hof breathing. It's essentially the same in terms of its fundamental effect
on your experience, your emotional well-being. And that is probably the most important finding. Now, the mechanisms are different. I'll make two other points. One is we're still hashing it out, but the physiological stress response may be differentially influenced in these different interventions. They're still changing up, we think, brain rewiring and neurochemistry in a positive way, but probably through different mechanisms. And then I think the second piece is you have to, we want both. We want high arousal, like vigorous walking, and we also want low arousal states. And part of what I feel very strongly about is that we just don't get the deep rest while we're awake. I don't get enough of it. I mean, I love retreats. They're huge resets, and morning practices are precious if you're doing that. But this is a model of these mind states. So it's, sorry for the virtual screen, but here you can see that this red state is very much where when we're actively coping with acute stress. It's not necessarily bad. We need that response, especially if we can nudge it toward a positive way. So we'll talk about more positive acute stress states. This yellow mind state is where, when I was saying, what are you holding right now? When you're just passively listening, that's where we walk around and spend most of our time. And we want to pay attention to releasing stress in those baseline states. And then there's green mind, true relaxation. And then there's these blue or purple mind states at the bottom, where we really can get there more, at least once a week. We should be getting there. And that's the true release, true letting go. Yoga nidra, yoga, shavasana, meditation, mind body practices are probably the quickest, most powerful way, or these breathing practices, especially if we do them for prolonged states. They are shifting. I talked about the gene expression change on a 1 week vacation at a retreat center. Regardless of what you're doing, our body needs those respite breaks, and it responds to them dramatically, turning on repair, DNA repair, all sorts of repair, cleaning junk out of the cells, cleaning up free radicals. That telomerase boost is also can clean up free radicals. It's not just for the telomere. So deep rest states are something this group, I mean, if you're coming here and doing it every morning, and I loved the music and the visual, that's powerful. That is the ideal. What if we all did that together every day? What if our leaders did right before the COP meeting? Just looking at you, Jim, with your nature screen, I mean, that's affecting me differently than if you had a big urban landscape behind you.
Yeah. Now, I have a lot more questions, but do you have anything further, Elissa, that you would like to share?
Well, I'm going to move on from telomeres. I think I've shared my view that, yes, I've been obsessed with them for over a decade. We know mostly with population-based data and somewhat with interventions, how to nudge them towards stability through our lifespan. And that is not, less sedentariness, more of a antioxidative, anti-inflammatory diet. Mediterranean diet's the best and easiest way to kind of summarize that. There are certain foods that are toxic to telomeres, certain that are really good for telomeres. We did an omega-3 study with Jan Kiekult-Glaser at Ohio State, and the more your body absorbs the omegas in your red blood cells, the longer your telomeres got. And these were like stressed older people. Processed red meat is associated with the shortest telomeres. Not surprising. It's already on the carcinogen list for the World Health Organization. We shouldn't be eating processed red meat, period. It's carcinogenic, as well as shortening your telomeres. What else? Sugared soda is, if there was one thing you could do for your health regularly that is going to speed up your aging, it would be drinking liquid sugar. We have, so there are several studies showing it's associated with shorter telomeres and other negative biological aging states. We have taken sweetened beverages out of all of our campuses and hospitals at UCSF, and we measured the effects and found that it was associated with a reduction in the abdominal fat and the belly size of people who are high soda drinkers. So people were very happy with not having it right in front of them at work. They could still bring it from home, but they weren't, because we also explained to people what liquid sugar was doing to their liver, even if they didn't worry about weight. So anyway, you got me off of my soda issues, but sugary beverages are addictive, and we're continually studying them now in different hospitals, and looking at how much it helps people, particularly service workers who are like constantly exposed to these drinks in their work environments. So I think that's the end of my telomere briefer, and I could now talk about the strategies in the stress prescription, Jim, if that sounds good.
Sure. Good.
So in the telomere effect, we did talk about some of the stress studies, and what was interesting is that people wanted to know more about that than lifestyle. And I guess that's not so surprising. We know what's good for the heart, we know what's good for the brain, and those are also good for the telomere. But when it comes to stress, there's all sorts of layers on nuances of what's good stress, what's bad stress. And so I mentioned toxic stress, chronic stress, like a real, really poor work conditions, conflictual relationship, caregiving. Those are examples of things that go on and on for years. And we know those are real huge challenges to our health. But what about short-term stress? What about daily stressors that we recover from? Or stressors that maybe we even expose ourselves to because they're exciting. We view them as challenges, as ways to grow. That is a fascinating area where we're learning so much about the thoughts, the physiology that go along with a positive stress response. And I will say that is really not harmful to our body, and in fact, in many cases can be beneficial or anti-aging. There is a form of stress called hormetic stress, where there's short-term repeated exposures to very moderate stressors in low doses to cells, to animals, and they tend to promote longevity. So that could be any type of physiological stress response: UV, hot, cold, oxidative stress, chemicals. I mean, the list goes on and on about what researchers have tested, but it creates this defense response and recovery so that the cell is inoculated to future stressors. So it's kind of like a vaccine where you strengthen the system so that when you're exposed to future somewhat similar stressors, you're resilient. So that's how we think about hormetic stress, or these short-term positive intermittent stressors. And we know so well in different animal studies how that works. So my colleague Gordon Lithgow at the Buck Institute did the early studies on worms. So if he heated them up a little bit, you get worm longevity. And if you heat them up too much, you get worm funerals, you get dead worms. So there's clearly this sweet spot, this inflection point And we want to find that in ourselves. And there isn't the research really to guide us. So it's really up to us to understand the principles here that short-term physical stress is health enhancing if we're not pushing it too far and we're giving ourselves time for recovery. So high intensity interval training is, of course, a beautiful example. But sauna is coming out to be, very health enhancing, but also to mood. And cold exposure is something that there's less research on, but it's certainly growing on the list. There's been lots of old studies on cryotherapy helping with depression and any sort of mental condition. So the back to psychological stress, we think that there's some kind of analogy here for when we push ourselves out of our comfort zone and are in stressful situations where we feel there's opportunity, growth, excitement, where it's somewhat manageable. Those are really positive physiological states, and they look different than the type of stressful situation where you just feel threat. There's nothing, you don't think there's anything that's good that could come out of it. You feel that, you completely feel your nervous system in your stomach, and you're probably having a lot of cortisol instead of adrenaline. And we all know what that's like. We're going to have that response, lots of the time, and we're going to get over it. But we can nudge ourselves to have more of that positive response with our thoughts. And many studies have done this, starting off with my colleague Wendy Mendez, also at UCSF, like nudging people to understand that stress response is actually good for you. If you can reframe that as my body's excited, my body's fueling itself so it can perform well, this is, exactly where I should be right now, mounting the stress response. Like that's a totally different reframe than we usually have, which is, this is terrible for my health. I'm going to do badly. So if we can shift ourselves toward this positive stress mindset, we're just helping ourselves.
Gotcha. So it's actually not the stress as much as the attitude that we have in response to whatever situation in which we find ourselves. You
said it. It's the narrative. How are we interpreting the situation? We can easily feel survival threat. We're just, and especially if we've had early trauma, we're going to have a blip of that, right? And it's going to be this automatic response. But then what? Then how can we then reshape that situation with our thoughts? And we can do that for each other in very powerful ways. If you're with someone who's stressed and you start saying these supportive statements, that is another, we're kind of socially contagious. And so we can transmit hope. We can transmit dread and fear so easily. So,
yeah.
So I have a chapter. Yeah. The chapter in the book is called Be the Lion. And the whole idea is helping us understand that the power of beliefs, the power of these statements right before or during stress, of how they drive our physiology toward either the threat or the challenge response. And like, if you imagine the lion chasing the gazelle, they're both having stress responses, but they're completely different. Gazelle's vasoconstricting, because gazelle may be at the end of her life and she knows it. Lion's like, tasty dinner. This is very exciting. It's the highlight of my week.
Yeah, and it's the same event.
Stress, blood pressure's high in each of them. That's not really telling us what's happening in their minds, in their bodies. So the stress prescription has 7 different practices, and it's guided by that rainbow I showed you, where we want to work the positive stress response, but we also want to hold our body in a ease state when we can. We can remind ourselves that we're safe. And we also want to have those deep release states, those deep rest states. So some of the principles, I'll just talk for, maybe 10 minutes about what's in that, and maybe we can open it up to Q&A. One of the principles is that we hate uncertainty. We hate uncertainty stress, some of us more than others. We measure that tendency in people, that personality difference, by asking things like, can you relax if you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow? And it's very natural to be like, no, not at all. I really want everything planned, everything to go as planned. And that's just not our reality, especially, that became extremely salient over the last 3 years during the pandemic. Uncertainty was a buzzword. I mean, one of our most common words we can feel it now. We know what that feels like to have an uncertain future, to have plans that may or may not happen, to write things down in pencil. And that's just going to become more and more the norm for us with the climate change, with this unstable Earth. So we have to think about, rethink how we even view life and time ahead of us, to embrace uncertainty, because this is our true reality, and it always has been, but now it's just more extreme. So there are some practices where we can build the uncertainty muscle, and the same with control. I mean, so much of our stress. I will just ask you, Jim, and everyone listening, is there a situation in your life that is unwanted? You think about it a lot. Why is it on your mind? Why is it causing stress? Most likely you can't control it. There's aspects of it that are not under your control. And there are lots of situations like this: our health, loved ones' health, addictions, certain work situations, issues in other people that bother us, but we can't change them. We can't change other people. So there's many big situations that you may or may not have in your life. And just even parsing out how much of the situation is out of your control, what within it can you control, you can always control our response, is part of the stress prescription. It's the stress inventory that we can take. And then there are practices for, in a sense, dropping the control that we never really had in the first place, and the freedom and the release in that. That's huge for me as a caregiver. I often am practicing radical acceptance and really, putting the baggage down when I can, when I don't need to be carrying something, problem solving. It's not real problem solving when we can't control things. So there's a lot of that kind of stress that we carry around us because of control or lack of control. So uncertainty and control are big for us to understand in our personal lives, like really applying it. And then there's different practices in the book. They can be summarized in 3 ways. We can control we can use our mind, very powerful, but it takes effort and training. So we were talking about, positive views of stress. Got to turn the light on of awareness, got to be mindful, look at what thoughts we have, and adopt more realistic research-based thoughts about the positive stress response. So that's an example of top-down strategies. Then there are, as well as understanding uncertainty and control, then there are body-up strategies, using the body to change the mind, either high metabolism stress in our body, or reducing and releasing stress, or both of those, even better. And then there's changing the scene, just really realizing how much our body, with all of its senses, is responsive to walking into the forest, to getting out of the office, to taking a walk, or sensory changes. Maybe it's a corner of our house that we have created as a calm spot with different, aromatherapy, different pictures. Those are more important than we think. There's lots of research showing that when we can open our sensory gates, we are changing our brain activity away from the amygdala and the self-referential negative thinking toward experiencing. And when we focus on our body, we do a body scan, we're experiencing the senses, and it's very hard to be ruminating and having a threat response at the same time. So those are 3, different buckets. Breathing is a big part. There's a whole chapter on breathing, like really trying to understand the different types of breathing. And I'm happy you're focusing on the resonant breathing, because I would agree with you that if we had to choose one, that's it. And there are other ways to, work with the breath. A little bit of breath holding can increase our tolerance to CO2, and super helpful for people with anxiety, particularly high on anxiety. Now, existential stress is something I wanted to discuss in particular with you in this group, because we have more existential stress, or let's say a different type than our ancestors, because we have a very volatile world that we see up close. We experience vicariously in our body through the news. And so we are very vulnerable to hopelessness, particularly our youth. We have a youth mental health crisis. And you and your listeners are particularly, I'll just say, working on being the beacon of hope and thinking about what you can do in your own single individual life or together in power with community. And so I am so interested in how people cope with the existential stress we have, because it's so easy to, as our youth do, to feel despair and hopelessness. And so I'm not going to offer research-based strategies. I will tell you some of my opinions, but I would love to hear from you and from our chat line here. How do you, let's say you're in California here, where we've had horrible wildfires and smoke. We've just had floods. How do you view this? What are ways that you stay hopeful, stay engaged with being part of the solution? Or, what are things that you say to yourself? I already know the things we say to ourselves that make us feel devastated and feel grief. We all experience that, and we will. And it's so it's this process of reminding ourselves of how we can live our best life, even though we're living in a traumatized earth in a way. So I'll let you respond, Jim.
You're asking a very profound question, and maybe, as they say, the $64,000 question of our time. How do we deal with existential threats? Mm-hmm. I'm thinking, for example, we're now in war in Ukraine, and we may have a nuclear exchange between the two superpowers. How do we kind of assimilate that information over a circumstance over which we have almost no control?
Yes.
And yet, like climate change, is bigger than we are and is highly corrosive on our interior and exterior worlds. And I've been wrestling with this mightily. And I just to offer two responses that I've generated, which keep me going. So this is like what we were saying about meditative techniques. Everybody has their own technique. But I've been profoundly influenced by Viktor Frankl's experience in Auschwitz, that no matter what the existential threat, our capacity to love, our capacity to find a deeper meaning is the fundamental determinant of how we navigate through whatever is happening day by day. And that revelation, that is, he was sitting in the depths of Auschwitz, he just began to imagine how much he loved his wife. And that gave him meaning. And to put texture on this, everyone, he had just been married. His wife was, I think, 2 trimesters pregnant.
Wow.
And they were rounded up and taken to Auschwitz. And he knew his wife was somewhere in the concentration camps. And he had no way to get to her. But he did know that he could love her.
That's amazing.
And I must say, Elissa, that book, I reread it last year just to remind myself what existential threat is and how there's a simplicity in our capacity to love one another and affirm who we are in this moment. And then for me, the second aspect is, I think all of us in the face of existential threats need to take a stand. And Humanity Rising is just taking a stand that it's possible, even in this moment, to illuminate a light that can shape the future possibilities of humankind. So I think for me, it's not only a disposition of being, of of affirmation of life in the face of existential ennui, as Heidegger put it, but also the capacity out of that affirmation to do something of that's essentially good in the world without thinking about whether this is going to make a difference or not. Because the existential threat is bigger than we are, just like Auschwitz was bigger than Viktor Frankl, but he could love. And day by day, he could support other people. And then he realized he was getting healthier and healthier. he was working on his telomeres, and he didn't even know what telomeres were.
I will tell you, I had the chills and teariness as you speak, how much we need each other for this type of hope and inspiration. And you are a beacon. And I'm seeing so many inspirational comments in the chat. And to know that we're global and connected in this way, it gives me so much hope. And that's why during the pandemic, when we just hit issue after issue, Humanity Rising was so important to be connected in this way. It's in the back of my book. I tell people they need to connect to it, because I don't know how everyone has found each other, but we are the future. We are creating the future, even though, as you said, we'll never see it or feel it or know our impact. We are it. We are our mind stands, our ability to feel that love of this life and this earth and nature and each other is the only force really that's strong enough to help us as we see the destruction and the hate of leaders, etc. It's really, I'm just going to stop there.
Well, I think that what I'm getting from this presentation and dialogue with you is something that I think is very important, and that is the primacy of attitude in whatever practice. That it's both the case that our practice need to serve us, but what determines the efficacy of our practice is the attitude. Going back to the lion and the gazelle, it's the attitude with which we're doing the practice as crucial. I'm thinking of Joe Dispenza and his great teaching that it is the combination of clear intention supported by positive emotions that makes the difference that we all seek. And that Deanna Rice put something in the chat that I think brings this. It's like a razor blade difference between anxiety and uncertainty, which is now ubiquitous in the world, and the willingness to stand on the precipice of the unknown and the great mystery. And that distinction is an attitude of mind that when you can cultivate the positive intention and cultivate positive emotions simultaneously, Dispenza says that's the healing elixir. That's the healing elixir. Would just love to have your comment on that.
I love the words that you have used. I think about that standing on the edge with the mystery of life, the unknown of the future, the joy of possibility of change. I feel like we are in the social tipping point. We don't know exactly where and how quickly it will happen, and maybe we will pass before we see the tip, but we are in it. And there's no chance that there won't be dramatic change given the trajectory of our fast destruction of the climate. So that's one example of our calling card here, of our, the need to change through the dramatic suffering that is happening and going to happen. So I'm excited that we are having this transformation, however, unfortunately, however slow it is, it's happening. And this community is a huge part of it. Just to be connected globally gives me so much hope. I have a model that I find so much hope from. And I write about it at the very end of my book, The Stress Prescription. And it's something like this, that we understand quantum change in the physical world somewhat, right? The physicists have described how there's non-local change on the other side of the world when something changes here that we can't perceive with our minds. But that is true, that there's quantum physics and quantum change in the physical world. In the social world, which is so tied with energy in the physical world, there is social quantum change. And social quantum change really spans from what we can understand and see, which is our local impact as humans, our ability to create a smile in someone, to have contagious, positive emotions of love and hope. And the reverse too. We can see how we have a local influence. What we can't see, but which is also true, is that we have a quantum social influence. And if we believe that together and we exert the biggest influence and ripples that we can in our local life, our local environment, what we can control, we are a powerful node in the social tipping point toward transformation that we all know needs to happen. And so this has been written up in a book by my colleague, Karen O'Brien, and it's called You Matter More Than You Think, Social Quantum Change. It's a beautiful book. It brings in all sorts of both theory and data to show that, to understand social change and to understand that just because we can't see it and feel it, we are part of it. That to me is also part, why and how I believe what you described about us being on the precipice and our beliefs and actions mattering so much. And this whole the uncertainty and the lack of control, viewing it in that positive way of, this is so exciting to be alive in this moment when the social world is changing so dramatically. We know that we have an influence, and even more so because we're living in such a volatile time, we get to have an impact. And, that makes our life, rather than thinking, poor me, and this is all gone to hell. It's more like, wow, what a time to be alive. Whew.
Yeah, the opportunity is proportional to the crisis. And we're in one big whopper of a crisis.
Yeah, we are.
And the point that you're making, Elissa, is a beautiful culmination of our discussion in some way, that both mysticism and science tell us that we're in a completely interconnected world at every level of our being. Our thoughts, our emotions, our bodies, our environment, everything is interpenetrating everything else. Our thoughts are being shaped by our social context and history, and how we think then radiates outward. So there's this outward to inner and inner to outward. Mm-hmm. And as the Stoics said 2,000 years ago, the only place where any of us have any control over a world that we cannot control is in our attitudes and the behaviors that we manifest from the inside out. And so this book of yours, the stress prescription, I think, Doctor, you've come up with the right foundation upon which all of us can build the kind of resilience to an increasingly stressed out world that is possible at this time. And so as we bring this to a close, I'd love to have your additional comments on this, and then just offer us, out of all the various prescriptions that you codify in your book, just a couple of prescriptions that people can do day by day, just to kind of build up as they order your book, which I hope all of us do, because this is the issue, everyone. How do we live abundant lives in a world that has never been stressed at this level at every category of existence and every level of our being. That's what's happening, is stress and stress and stress. So what Elissa is saying is that's the biggest opportunity of our lives. And there's certain prescriptions and simple practices that we can embody that gives us the enabling capacity to navigate with abundance and in a way that brings goodness into the world. It's beautiful, beautiful what you're doing, Elissa. Just beautiful.
Thank you so much. And, you know, I've just been trying to transmit what I've needed so much. You know, I use all these practices and wisdom teachings, and you've been a bright light too, Jim, a teacher to me as well. So I will say that waking up and going to bed with a few questions that we can ask ourselves can help us shift from the the body state of being an animal that feels threat. We're all prone to this, to tapping into love, hope, and purpose. And so I'm going to tell you what some of the questions are, but I think what even more important is understanding and trusting that we're all waking up across the world with these beautiful intentions as humans and actions, and the power that we have together in creating those waves of change is beautiful. Even though it's, it feels just local, just understanding if we're all doing it together, it's a big wave. And so, I get so much positive emotion and hope through connection, through collaborating on projects and, being part of communities like this. And there aren't many. I don't know of another Humanity Rising, but there are, other topically focused ones. I know the One Earth Sangha is one that I love, which is Dharma talks about climate. So when we wake up, we're often in our bodies really searching for cues and saying, what's it going to be today? Do I need to, how high does my cortisol need to shoot up? And that is how we wake up on one day is very similar to how we wake up on other days. So what I mean is we're kind of in a set point of the habit, and we can shape that. And so waking up and giving ourselves, for example, the few minutes of breathing, maybe it's breathing together, depending on your time zone here, and asking yourself, what today do I look forward to? What in my day is something that is meaningful to me? Is there an opportunity to make someone smile? Is there something in my day that I'm grateful for? Just one of these questions is all you need, because they all kind of go together, but just focusing on something positive in your day that brings you meaning. And I don't mean big North Star, we're going to change the world. I mean, actually within your day, within your control, on your path, what can you bring love to and presence and more purpose to? How we show up. And that is, that's the energy, right? That's the regenerative energy of joy that we need. We need it these days more than ever. And going to bed, what went better? I think that reflection of realizing maybe something went better than expected, or some savoring, just that reliving of some positive moments, and maybe even telling someone about that, like at the dinner table, what was your favorite part of the day? Helping each other, even just hearing someone's worst part. We do the dinner game, we do the worst part of the day and the best part of the day. And so it's that witnessing and just supporting, not problem solving, but being present, and maybe even giving some perspective, time perspective, that sounds really hard, very stressful. Is that going to affect you in a year from now? And almost always our daily stressors are really quite small. And so we can dismiss them more when we get that kind of perspective, the impermanence of the daily stress.
Yeah, that's what causes the cortisol. We're making mountains out of molehills.
Absolutely. And you're having some humor about our bodies. Like that's
Yeah,
exactly how we're wired. We don't know the difference between the social stress and the lion who's going to have us for dinner.
yeah. What you're bringing to my mind, Elissa, is that beautiful documentary of the relationship between the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. If you haven't seen it, it's on Netflix. I forget what it's called,
Called
but they
Mission
both,
Joy. Wonderful recommendation. Yes.
yeah, what they both agree on was what you just said, is this capacity to embrace life in the ordinary flow with joy that really constitutes what they understand to be enlightenment. I mean, this is the Dalai Lama, and this is Desmond Tutu, and they came down exactly in the same place. Is how do we begin with joy and gratitude, and how do we end our day with joy and gratitude? Simply that we're alive
Yes. The
at this moment.
sacredness,
It's a
sacredness of
sacred
every
time.
day. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's an app that I helped develop that goes along with Mission Joy, and I would love people to sign up for it. It's global. It's in 190 countries. We call it the Big Joy Project. And does His Holiness and Archbishop asked the documentary maker, Peggy Callahan, to spread joy. He said, "What's my biggest hope is not just that people see this film, but that they feel joy. Can you spread joy?" And so she came to me and other researchers and said, how can we do a big citizen science global project where we know that joy practices, gratitude, kindness, these will increase joy? How can we bring this to people? So we have this really lovely 7-day experience based on the Greater Good Science Center platform that people can sign up for. If you type in the Big Joy Project, I think you will get to it. And you can sign up, and it's of course free. You're providing data, you're doing a service to science, but it's about 5 minutes each morning. You'll do a different practice, and then of course tell us how you feel.
It's all about joy, everyone. Elissa Epel, thank you so much. This has been both brilliant and inspiring and joyful. So I just want to thank you for all the research you've done about stress in our time, and now your stress prescription, a book that everybody should order and take very, very seriously, because around our relationship with stress, I believe the future of humanity will be determined, because the crisis of stress and the crisis of our existential existence is deeper than ever before. And that opportunity is before us. And this book gives us some fundamental principles to guide us along our way. So, Elissa, thank you so much. Bless you.
Thank you so much, Jim, for all you do. Thank you, everyone, for your time and your own hard work.
That does it for us for today, everyone. You're welcome to the after session chat group. Stan just put the link in the chat, and we'll see you all tomorrow. We'll begin a 4-day program on women at the front lines of democracy in America. Thanks so much, Elissa. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.
See you tomorrow.